In the quiet chambers of Burkina Faso's transitional parliament, a decision was made that echoed far beyond the borders of this landlocked nation. In a move that stunned both local observers and international voices, the government passed a unanimous vote. Homosexuality is now a criminal offense, punishable by imprisonment, fines, and even deportation. Just 2 years ago, Burkina Faso stood apart in West Africa, a country without anti-gay laws on its books where silence, not sanction, governed private life. And now, that silence has shattered. But why? Why now? Why is the continent witnessing a sudden cascade of anti-LGBT legislation? Is this about family values? Or is something far deeper reshaping the political and cultural heartbeat of Africa? The answers lie not only in the law, but in a larger awakening, one led by the fiery captain of a new order, Ibrahim Traore. This is not just about morality. It's about sovereignty. It's about who decides the soul of a nation. Stay with us. This moment is not just a legal shift. It's a mirror of Africa's moral awakening. Subscribe to Africa Rising Voice and join the movement reclaiming our story. For more than 6 decades, Burkina Faso existed in a peculiar state of legal neutrality. While much of Africa criminalized same-sex relationships under laws inherited from colonial rule, this small West African nation remained silent. It neither endorsed nor condemned homosexuality in its legal code. This silence, often misunderstood, as tolerance was in truth a product of omission, a gap in the statutes that neither protected nor prosecuted. That era came to an end in September 2025. It began in 2024, when Burkina Faso's transitional government, led by Captain Ibrahim Traore, quietly proposed an amendment to the nation's family code. The draft law sought to define homosexuality for the first time in the country's legal history as a criminal offense. At the time, it garnered little international attention. But inside Burkina Faso, especially in religious and cultural circles, the proposal struck a chord. It reflected long-standing societal discomforts that had never been written into law, but were felt in homes, sermons, and family conversations. The momentum behind the law built swiftly. Less than a year later, in a single parliamentary session held in Ouagadougou, the amendment was passed with unanimous support. There was no dissent, no abstention, no political hesitation. The silence of the past had been replaced by a full-throated declaration. The new law imposes penalties ranging from 2 to 5 years in prison, coupled with financial fines. In a sharp escalation, it also includes deportation clauses for foreign nationals found guilty of same-sex conduct, making it clear that the law applies not only to citizens, but to visitors as well. Justice Minister Edasso Rodrigue-Baya defended the legislation in stark terms, describing it as a measure to protect society from bizarre behavior. His words, though controversial abroad, resonated domestically. Burkina Faso is a country where over 90% of the population identifies with a religion, and where cultural conservatism remains strong across both urban and rural populations. But the question must be asked, why now? Why would a nation that had quietly sidestepped this issue for so long suddenly make it a legal priority? To answer that, one must look beyond the borders of Burkina Faso and recognize a pattern playing out across the continent. The 2020s have seen a striking rise in anti-LGBT legislation throughout Africa. Uganda's 2023 law made global headlines for introducing the death penalty for what it termed aggravated homosexuality. Mali, Burkina Faso's Sahelian neighbor, enacted its own version under a junta-led government. Ghana and Nigeria have long debated or implemented restrictive laws, often under the banner of defending traditional African values. In this context, Burkina Faso's decision appears less like an anomaly and more like alignment, a synchronized step in a regional pattern. The continent, many argue, is experiencing a cultural reassertion, and in that wave, homosexuality has become a symbolic battleground. Yet Burkina Faso's case is unique. It didn't inherit anti-LGBT laws from British rule, as did Nigeria or Uganda. It was colonized by France, whose post-colonial penal codes were different. When Burkina Faso gained independence in 1960, it left behind not only colonial rule, but also colonial criminal codes on morality. Thus, for more than half a century, the state had no official stance. There were no protections, but also no prosecutions. This made Burkina Faso one of the very few African nations where same-sex relationships were not, on paper, illegal. This absence of legal persecution mattered deeply. It offered a fragile space where members of the LGBT community, though not embraced by society, were at least not hunted by the state. That space is now gone. Critics argue that the new law risks violating human rights and could endanger vulnerable groups. Activists fear that it will lead to increased stigma, discrimination, and even violence against people perceived as different. But within Burkina Faso, these criticisms are often dismissed as external interference, another example of the West imposing its moral framework on African societies. The government has presented the law not as an invention of new values, but as a formal recognition of cultural and religious realities that already shape Burkinabe life. To many, the law is simply the state catching up with the people. Still, the shift from silence to punishment is dramatic, and it forces a critical question. If Burkina Faso was never legally hostile to homosexuality, why choose this moment to codify its rejection? Could this be about more than morality? Could it be part of a broader movement toward political and cultural sovereignty, where asserting control over moral law becomes a statement of independence? This is where the story begins to deepen, not just into questions of law, but into questions of identity, resistance, and power. But was this truly a legal cleanup, or the first signal of a deeper ideological storm? The vote itself lasted only minutes, but its impact reverberated across cities, villages, and international headlines. On that September day in 2025, Burkina Faso's transitional parliament did more than legislate. They made a declaration, and the entire country felt it. In the capital, Ouagadougou, supporters gathered outside government buildings, some waving national flags, others chanting in support of family values and African morality. Religious leaders praised the decision from pulpits and minarets. In mosques, Friday sermons echoed the themes of protection and preservation. In churches, the law was framed as a return to divine order. Across both Islamic and Christian communities, a rare consensus emerged. This, they believed, was a righteous act. The popular support surprised no one. In a country where faith permeates daily life and where social conservatism is deeply embedded in the cultural fabric, the law found fertile ground. Parents discussed it over dinner tables. Elders nodded in approval during town hall meetings. Community leaders framed it as a necessary defense against a world losing its moral compass. But beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the response was starkly different. Human rights organizations immediately condemned the law. Amnesty International labeled it a dangerous regression. The United Nations issued a cautious but clear statement, expressing concern over the erosion of individual freedoms. The World Bank, already in tense negotiations with the Burkinabe government over governance benchmarks, hinted at potential consequences, including the suspension of certain financial agreements. Western media outlets painted Burkina Faso's move as part of a troubling continental trend. Headlines referred to Africa's anti-LGBT wave and warned of a rollback in human rights. Social media lit up with activists calling for sanctions, travel bans, and funding restrictions. Some called on international donors to cut ties entirely, but the government in Ouagadougou was unmoved. Justice Minister Edaso Rodrigue Baya, in a follow-up interview, dismissed the criticism as colonial arrogance disguised as concern. Captain Ibrahim Traore, though not directly commenting, allowed state media to broadcast messages defending the law as a reflection of the people's will. For the Burkinabe leadership, this was not about appeasing international expectations. It was about charting their own course, one rooted in history, culture, and sovereignty, and the regional context only reinforced that position. In Uganda, just 2 years earlier, President Yoweri Museveni had signed one of the world's harshest anti-LGBT laws into effect, including provisions for the death penalty in specific cases. Despite global outcry and financial penalties, the law remained in force. Uganda's defiance became a symbol of resistance, an inspiration to others. Mali, under its military leadership, had quietly passed restrictions mirroring those in Burkina Faso. Ghana's parliament debated legislation that would not only criminalize homosexual acts, but also punish those who advocate for LGBT rights. Nigeria maintained strict laws against same-sex relationships and consistently enforced them. Across the continent, it became clear that what was unfolding was not a series of isolated incidents, but a continental shift. To Western audiences, it appeared as a coordinated backlash, but inside Africa it was seen differently. It was not merely rejection, it was reclamation. For years, African leaders have chafed at the perception that their nations must conform to foreign standards of morality in exchange for aid or approval. Many see Western pressure to adopt LGBT-inclusive policies not as progress, but as cultural imperialism. The debate, therefore, is not simply about sexuality, it is about who gets to decide what is moral. In this environment, Burkina Faso's decision felt inevitable. Still, the speed and unanimity of the vote shocked many observers. Even in countries with similar laws, parliamentary divisions often appeared. Not so in Ouagadougou. The parliament, though transitional and unelected, spoke with one voice, and that voice said, "We decide what governs us." The real crescendo of this moment was not in the law itself, but in what it represented. It marked the clearest break yet between Burkina Faso and the liberal norms championed by the international community. It signaled that the state was willing to endure financial, diplomatic, or reputational damage in defense of its chosen values. It also marked a turning point in how African nations see each other, rather than being swayed by fear of Western consequences. Burkina Faso appeared emboldened by regional solidarity. The law became part of a broader narrative, one of Africa rising, not through compliance, but through conviction. But there are risks. Already, reports indicate that civil society groups have come under pressure. NGOs focusing on sexual health, mental health and youth counseling report increasing scrutiny. Some have had their funding frozen, others have been accused of promoting foreign ideologies. At the same time, foreign investors are expressing concern. Several embassies issued travel advisories warning LGBTQ+ citizens to exercise caution. Donor conferences were reportedly cancelled or postponed. Behind the scenes, economic ripple effects are beginning to form, and yet, within the nation, support remains strong. There is no mass protest, no media rebellion. The law has tapped into something deep, a cultural foundation that has long remained beneath the surface, unspoken but ever present. International observers may ask how such a law could pass without resistance. But the better question may be, how did it remain unspoken for so long? And now that it is law, will this be the final act of legal alignment, or the opening salvo of a broader ideological realignment? Will international pressure fracture this new African unity or only strengthen its resolve? To understand the real weight of Burkina Faso's new law, one must step beyond headlines and international statements and enter the homes, mosques, churches, and council halls where identity is not debated, it is lived. Because here, in this deeply spiritual land, law is more than legislation. It is the mirror of moral life. Burkina Faso is not a secular society in the Western sense. Nearly every citizen identifies with a faith, and that faith does not sit in private. It governs public life. Islam and Christianity dominate, but traditional belief systems are still deeply embedded, especially in rural areas. This complex spiritual mosaic shares one common thread: a collective rejection of homosexuality as incompatible with community values. For many Burkinabe, this is not a conversation about individual choice. It is a question of cosmic balance. What one does in private, they believe, can affect not only the household, but the village, the ancestors, even the spiritual peace of the nation. Morality is not a personal expression. It is a duty to the whole. So when the Justice Minister described same-sex acts as bizarre behavior, he was not inventing a new rhetorical weapon. He was echoing language long spoken in family gatherings and worship spaces. It may sound crude in foreign ears, but to many inside Burkina Faso it sounds like truth. This explains why the law passed so effortlessly and why opposition to it is nearly non-existent domestically. The law did not lead society, it followed it. Still, that following carries profound consequences. First, for civil society, local NGOs working in public health, education, and human rights now operate in a climate of uncertainty. Organizations offering support to vulnerable groups, particularly young people grappling with questions of identity, find themselves under unofficial watch. Some report a chilling effect: volunteers quitting, events cancelled, funding delayed. In this new landscape, neutrality is no longer safe. Silence has become complicity. Second, for political identity. Since seizing power in 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traore has positioned himself as a revolutionary leader, not only militarily, but culturally. He has expelled French forces, cut dependency on Paris, and reoriented Burkina Faso's alliances toward neighbors like Mali and Niger, as well as to Russia and China. In this broader project of Sahelian sovereignty, the anti-LGBT law serves as a moral pillar. It declares, as plainly as the removal of foreign troops, that we govern ourselves. Traore's supporters see this as the birth of a new era, one where African values are no longer apologized for, but proclaimed. To them, the law is not a distraction from deeper problems. It is part of the solution. They believe that a nation uncertain of its identity cannot be secure, no matter how many soldiers it deploys. But not everyone is convinced. Some Burkinabe intellectuals and younger urbanites worry that the law represents a form of cultural fundamentalism. They fear it could open the door to wider crackdowns on freedom of thought and expression. Others worry about diplomatic backlash, especially in the form of economic sanctions or stalled development aid. In a country battling inflation, insecurity, and unemployment, such isolation could be costly. Still, even these concerns rarely question the cultural reasoning behind the law. Rather, they challenge the timing, the priorities, or the potential unintended consequences. In that sense, the law has achieved rare status. It is culturally hegemonic, even if politically debated. And this is precisely why it matters. Because Burkina Faso is not simply copying Uganda or Nigeria. It is asserting something uniquely Burkinabe, a view of national rebirth that includes moral self-definition. Under Traore, the state is not just fighting jihadists, it is fighting what it sees as spiritual confusion imported through globalization. This redefinition is powerful, but it is not without paradox. For a government that claims to reject foreign influence, it risks isolating itself from the very global systems it needs to survive. The same international banks, donors, and investors who preach human rights are also those with the capacity to support infrastructure, education, and economic growth. A nation cannot grow on principle alone, and yet the Burkina Faso government is betting that solidarity from within, among Sahelian neighbors and new global partners, can compensate for that loss. Whether that bet pays off remains to be seen, but one thing is certain, this is no longer just about sexuality. It is about a nation asking, who are we? Who gets to say what is right or wrong? What does it mean to be African, not just in skin or ancestry, but in moral foundation? These questions are shaping the country's future more than any military budget or foreign loan, and they demand engagement, not only from policymakers or activists, but from the people themselves. Do you believe Africa needs to defend its soul before anything else? If you feel this in your spirit, speak truth in the comments below. Because in the end, Burkina Faso's greatest test may not be resisting outside judgment. It may be this: can a nation build unity around identity without sowing new division in the process? But can identity be defended without turning it into a wall? Burkina Faso's decision to criminalize homosexuality did not take place in a vacuum. It arrived in a world where morality, human rights, and national sovereignty are constantly at odds, especially between Africa and the West. From Washington to Brussels, the reaction was swift. Statements of condemnation poured in, framed in the language of international law and universal human rights. Western embassies in West Africa issued travel warnings. Advocacy groups in Europe and the United States pushed for sanctions. Editorials in the New York Times and The Guardian called the law a step backwards. But the Burkina Faso leadership did not flinch. This defiance did not begin in 2025. It is the culmination of a decade-long shift in how African states relate to the global order, particularly those in the Sahel region. Under Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso has joined its neighbors, Mali and Niger, in forging a new path, one that rejects the traditional influence of former colonial powers and instead seeks alternatives in the East and within Africa itself. The logic is strategic. While Western governments often tie aid, trade, and diplomatic engagement to compliance with liberal social values, countries like Russia and China make no such demands. Instead, they offer military assistance, infrastructure development, and economic partnerships, no questions asked. For Burkina Faso, this is not just about policy, it is about breathing room to define its own identity, room to make its own laws, room to decide what kind of society it wants to build without having to apologize to Paris, London, or Washington. In this new framework, laws like the anti-LGBT legislation are not simply acts of governance, they are acts of geopolitical signaling. They say, we are no longer under your influence, but such independence comes at a price. The World Bank, the European Union, and other multilateral institutions are now re-evaluating their financial arrangements. With Burkina Faso, donor-funded projects may face delays or cancellations. Investment deals could dry up under pressure from global civil society. For a country already grappling with security threats and economic hardship, these consequences are not trivial. Yet the government seems prepared. They are placing their hopes in regional solidarity, a new Sahelian alliance not only built on military cooperation, but on shared values. The leadership believes that by standing together, these nations can withstand international pressure and reshape Africa's role in the world. Still, a question lingers in the background. In pushing back so hard against the West, Are these countries creating space for self-determination or simply trading one set of dependencies for another? Will ties with Russia or China bring true sovereignty or just a different kind of leverage? This delicate dance between assertion and alignment is the new frontier of African diplomacy. As alliances shift, is the world ready for an Africa no longer asking for permission? What lies ahead for Burkina Faso and for Africa more broadly may depend less on the laws passed today and more on how these choices are sustained tomorrow. The path chosen by Ibrahim Traore's government is bold, but it is also filled with uncertainty. By anchoring national identity in moral sovereignty, Burkina Faso has taken a stand. But can that stand hold if the ground beneath it begins to shake? Already, the economic pressure is mounting. Foreign investment is slowing. International agencies are reassessing cooperation. Aid may dwindle and markets may tighten. For a nation still recovering from years of insurgency and political instability, the economic cost of sovereignty could be steep. Domestically, the law has drawn praise from traditionalists, but it has also begun to create quiet discomfort among younger generations, particularly in urban centers. Many young Burkinabe, connected through smartphones and social media, are navigating a world of ideas that stretches far beyond national borders. They are not necessarily opposed to tradition, but they are asking new questions. Questions about identity, about expression, about belonging. If not addressed with care, these generational tensions could fester. What began as a unifying gesture could become a line of division. At the same time, the regional alliance between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is gaining momentum. By forming a Sahelian bloc focused on cultural and political independence, these countries are trying to build a new African center of gravity, one that does not orbit around the West, and therein lies the opportunity. If these nations can translate their moral assertions into economic and political resilience, they could offer a powerful model for the rest of the continent. One in which Africa Rising is not just a slogan, but a reality rooted in self-determination, not submission. To do so, they will need more than ideology. They will need infrastructure, education, regional trade, and Pan-African solidarity. They will need leaders who can uphold tradition without turning it into dogma, and who can hear the voices of elders without silencing the hopes of youth. They will also need courage, because the road ahead will not be easy. Every step taken in defense of cultural sovereignty will invite scrutiny. Every decision to resist external norms will trigger consequences. But if done with wisdom, unity, and vision, it may mark the beginning of a new African chapter. A chapter in which freedom is not defined for Africa, but defined by Africa. So what now? Can the continent rise without apology, or will the weight of the world pull it back? In the heart of West Africa, beneath the blazing Sahel sun, a message has been carved into law, not just in Burkina Faso's penal code, but in the conscience of a continent. That message is simple, yet profound. We will decide for ourselves. The TIA law criminalizing homosexuality may be controversial in the eyes of the world, but within Burkina Faso it stands as a symbol of cultural conviction. For supporters, it is not hatred, it is heritage. Not exclusion, it is expression. It is a declaration that Africa's moral compass will no longer be imported, but drawn from its own soil. Under Ibrahim Traore, this small nation has done more than reject foreign influence. It has sparked a broader question that resonates across borders. Who defines what is right and wrong in Africa? The answer, increasingly, is Africa itself. This is the deeper meaning behind the moment we have just witnessed Beyond the headlines and hashtags lies a movement, an Africa rising, where sovereignty is not limited to land or arms, but extends to values, identity, and law. But this movement comes with responsibility. If Africa claims the right to define itself, then it must also build the future it envisions. It must prove that dignity and development can walk hand in hand. That moral clarity does not preclude economic progress. That cultural independence is not isolation, but leadership. For those of us watching from the diaspora, from the corners of forgotten history, from the margins of global politics, this is not the time to judge. It is the time to understand, to engage, to believe. Because Africa is not retreating. It is rising with its back straight, its voice clear, and its future unapologetically its own. If this story moves something in your chest, do not just scroll. Like, share, and speak up. Subscribe. Our history was muted for too long. Let us say our future out loud. New Africa. Africa rise. Ibrahim Traore. Africa rising.